the mystery of the construction of the Great Pyramid, which, contrary to archaeological views, has never been solved.
Right.
Nobody knows how it was done. I mean, you are looking at 6 million tons, 13-acre footprint, 481 feet tall, 2.5 million blocks of stone in its construction.
How'd they do it?
Nobody knows how it was done.
Do you know
I have
a
no
theory?
clue.
I mean, how could anyone know? Archaeologists proposed the idea that they built wet
ramps
sand.
are the main theory. And sliding blocks along wet sand, which is fine at ground level, but really difficult to do 300 feet above the sand, you know. And the notion of ramps is problematic because those ramps couldn't have a slope in excess of 10 degrees. And if you're going to get to the top of the Great Pyramid, 480 feet above the ground,
that's a steep,
with a top of 10 degrees, you're looking at a gigantic ramp. It's much bigger than the Great Pyramid itself. And if it's going to support the weight of multi-ton megaliths, then it's got to be really solid. It can't just be an earthen ramp. It's got to be a stone ramp. And where's all that stuff gone? There's all sorts of proposals and suggestions, but there are no facts on the construction of the Great Pyramid.
I like the theory of acoustic levitation.
This is one of the areas where archaeologists attack.
They're like, oh, what are you talking about?
Because I'm referencing indigenous myths and traditions from ancient Egypt and from many cultures which speak of large megaliths being moved into place with sound. The use of sound,
which is a scientific thing, just not on that scale yet.
Yeah, it's happening now on a very small scale. It's
right.
possible to use sound to levitate tiny objects. Well, if you can use sound to levitate tiny objects, perhaps you can use it to levitate very large objects as well. Perhaps we're looking at a lost science here.
Well, and
we don't understand.
That's the thing.
And actually, you know, I don't dwell in my work very much on that. I talk of the ancient Egyptian priests chanting blocks into the air because that is an ancient Egyptian tradition. But when archaeologists want to attack my work, that's the 1.5 pages in one book
they
pick on and say, this is what Hancock's work is all about. I think we're confronted by an enormous mystery with megalithic sites all around the world, and we don't understand them properly. In Peru, at Sacsayhuaman, Cusco, the Sacred Valley, there are extraordinary megalithic sites there. Sacsayhuaman is the best known of them, with giant megaliths fitted together with incredible precision. These are like jigsaw puzzles, and no single megalith is the same shape as another one, but they're all cut and placed to fit perfectly together so that you can't even get a sheet of paper in between the block. One of my principal informants there at Cusco is Jesus Gamarra, who himself is a descendant. He thinks that the Incas found that work already there.
Oh, wow.
And that they overbuilt and built around it. And he speaks of ancient Peruvian traditions, and others do, about some kind of plant which softened so that they could mold it, almost like
Play-Doh or something,
and mold it into shape. And then suddenly, if that were the case, many anomalies of those huge megaliths, like the holes in them that don't make any sense. I'm not saying that's how it was done. I'm saying that we should be open to these extraordinary possibilities and not just write them off as absolute nonsense. And we should respect the indigenous traditions that speak of them.
What do you think of, there's some controversy around, is the connection of the pyramids across the planet?
Ancient cultures all around the world preserved a memory of a high civilization. In India, it was called Kumari Kanda. But if you go to Mesopotamia, you're going to find the same story of a great flood and survivors of a flood who taught knowledge around the world. You're going to find the same story in ancient Egypt. You're going to find the same story everywhere. As a matter of fact, the Atlantis story is present in ancient Egypt. They just don't call it Atlantis. They use a different word for it. Atlantis is not an ancient Egyptian word, but that's not surprising if we consider the pedigree of the Atlantis story. The Atlantis story, as it's come down to us, the earliest surviving reference to it is in the works of Plato,
right?
Who is a revered figure in his own right, the Greek philosopher Plato, and in his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. And Plato draws his information from an individual who may well have been an ancestor of his, Solon, the great Greek lawmaker. And he was a traveler, and he made a well-documented visit to Egypt around about the year in our calendar, 600 BC. And in that visit to Egypt, as Plato reports the story, as he had received it, as he reports it in these dialogues, Solon was told by the priests of the Temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta, a temple that no longer exists. He pointed to writings on the walls, and there was a priest who spoke Greek and ancient Egyptian, and he asked that priest to tell him, what do these writings say? And the priest then repeated the story of Atlantis, and Plato put that into the Greek language as Atlantis. We don't know what the ancient Egyptians called it there, but I do know that they called it the homeland of the primeval ones, from another temple. Solon then asks the priests, so this Atlantis was destroyed in an enormous flood. When did that happen? And they said quite matter-of-factly, 9,000 years ago. So there you need to do the math. This is 600 BC that Solon is receiving that information that he transmits to Plato. 9,000 years before 600 BC is 11,623 years ago, if you wish to be precise. And this is one of the reasons why I take Plato's report seriously, because 11,600 years ago was one of those massive pulses of meltwater that coincided with the ending of the last ice age, just as the Younger Dryas began 12,800 years ago with an anomalous sea level rise documented in the work of Cesare Emiliani. Just as it began with a sea level rise, it also ended 11,600 years ago with a massive sea level rise, which is called Meltwater Pulse 1b. And when archaeologists try to get rid of this, they say, well, look, Meltwater Pulse 1b unfolded over a period of 600 years. So in any one year, if you do the average, it wasn't that much. But that's not how the meltwater pulse worked. There were years of massive rises in sea level. And again, this is documented in the death of corals. There were years when not much happened. So averaging it out over 600 years is not the way to do it. We have a time, relatively recent history ago, when there was an enormous global flood. And is it a coincidence that Plato names precisely that time for the submergence of Atlantis? I don't think so. And finally, of course, there's the fact that Göbekli Tepe, this extraordinary megalithic site in Turkey, as far as we can tell now, the work began on that site, guess when? 11,600 years ago. I can't help feeling that we're looking at a project that was initiated by survivors of that cataclysm, to bring to that place skills and knowledge that had not previously existed in that place, to create a gigantic megalithic site, indeed partly for spiritual reasons, but also partly to mobilize a local population, to give them a big project to work on, and during that project to teach them agriculture. At the beginning, Göbekli Tepe was entirely inhabited by hunter-gatherers. 1,000 years later, they were all agriculturalists. And during those 1,000 years, the whole Göbekli Tepe was created. And then, lo and behold, once that was achieved, it was buried, deliberately buried. These stone circles were filled up with piles of rubble, and then they created a rubble hill over the top of the whole thing. And that's why Göbekli Tepe is such an important site, because it then remains sealed. It's a sealed site, and it's 11,600 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that coincides with Meltwater Pulse 1b. We can either choose to just say all of this is coincidence and it has no significance,
Right.
or in my case, I think it's not coincidence, and I think it's really worth looking at the implications of all of this.
You're not saying Atlantis is that lost advanced civilization necessarily.
I'm saying that there was a culture that emerged out of shamanism, that developed certain skills, that was able to explore the world and almost certainly influenced other cultures around the world.